From the MCA DSV offices in Jefferson City, I'm Public Affairs Director Matthew Huffman, and this is Momentum, a webcast produced by your coalition connecting advocates across our state. In this month's webisode, we're going to be talking about a training we had earlier this month where we welcomed faculty from American University's College of Law and the National Immigrant Women's Attorney Project. Joining me today for the conversation, we have Prevention Specialist Nicole Crespi, Member Services Specialist Gail Reynoso, and Legal Resources Specialist Samantha Gormley. Welcome, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew.
So, I kind of wanted to just have us go around and talk about the training from earlier this month. Whenever folks came in from the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project. So the three of you attended that training, and because all of you have very different roles, kind of different lenses that you took with you into the training, that you brought out of the training, I thought it would be a great opportunity for you to share those perspectives with folks who might not have been there. So to kind of get us started, I know that the training was really kind of marketed for advocates and attorneys, but the actual makeup was much broader than that. So there were a lot of interpreters who attended, some therapists, social workers, folks from legal services who might not be attorneys. So from your all's perspective, why is it important to bring all those folks together in the same room?
This is Gail, and I can start the answer to that question. I think that the trainers, Rocio Molina and Leslie Orloff, did a really great job of helping folks to see that immigrant survivors of violence in the United States really need a holistic approach because their immigration status often plays into so many different parts of their experience as survivors of violence. And so they may have a family law case, they may have an immigration case, they may have a need to access public benefits, they may or may not speak proficient English, so they may be needing language access provision. And so the training was sort of looking at specifically advocates and attorneys' roles in supporting survivors, but ultimately kind of became looking at advocates and attorneys and interpreters and social workers and community members' role in supporting survivors in accessing all these different services to truly meet their needs in a holistic way.
This is Samantha. I thought that it was really fascinating because even within the room, you would watch people take notes not only when the presenters were talking, but also when other people within the room were talking and sharing stories about people that they've worked with. And I think that it was incredibly helpful for people for all of the different backgrounds in the room to hear what other people had to offer, both in regards to immigrant survivors, but also a lot of it was how it translates to maybe working with survivors who aren't immigrants and how a lot of it is you're going to use very similar advocacy, just maybe slightly different tools. And I think that brought a level of comfort to the people in the room who might have otherwise been a lot more nervous about doing this kind of advocacy. They seemed to get a lot of comfort from that kind of exposure from the others.
Yeah. Well, and kind of building on what both of you said, I want to lift out a couple things. So, Gail, you mentioning that it really represented this holistic approach to providing services to immigrant survivors. And then, Sammy, what you said about people taking notes as others were talking too. So a really great space to bring people from a variety of backgrounds together and network and learn from one another. So you have a wealth of knowledge from the two trainers, and you also have that peer sharing and resource sharing.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of networking happening. We saw people exchanging business cards and names and telephone numbers, and then we also saw them sort of recognizing like, oh, as a family law attorney, I've helped folks with custody and divorce cases where immigration was a concern, but I didn't see that as part of my work. My focus is on the custody case or the divorce case. But when the survivor in those situations fears deportation, and the perpetrator in those situations is using that fear as leverage in a custody case or divorce case, the family law attorney really needs to be acknowledging the dynamic and addressing it head on and helping the survivor recognize that there are Violence Against Women Act protections that cover the immigration relief piece of that custody case. And so the perpetrator under federal law isn't supposed to be using or be able to use that as a way to continue to manipulate and control the survivor. But if the family law attorney doesn't know that, they can't address that. So working with an immigration attorney in a divorce case can really be effective. And I think that's what we were seeing coming out of some of these scenarios and role plays is, oh gosh, I don't have to do this by myself. The immigration dynamics that are playing out here in different spaces in the survivor's life, we could all be working together to address that, and I don't have to do it by myself.
I think it was also a very good reminder for the attorneys in the room. It is kind of easy to get siloed, but it really is. There's a lot of ethical considerations when you're working with survivors of violence and making sure that when you're advocating for them, that you're doing it in a holistic approach, and any area in which you do need more expertise, that you know who to reach out to and how to get that in order to most zealously advocate for your client. And I think in these cases, it was also a good reminder of the things that if we don't continue to seek more information and then say that it's not a part of our practice, we can actually be doing real damage to our clients, which is what nobody in that room wants to do. Mm-hmm. And the importance of being able to be aware and know who you can access to get that kind of information that you need in order to best protect the people you're working with.
Yeah, and then we saw some of the folks like interpreters who were saying it's really challenging when my role is just to convey messages between two parties, but I'm hearing red flags and I want to make a decent referral, or maybe take the attorney aside later and say, hey, I've been to this training, I'm hearing red flags regarding domestic violence or sexual violence, or this person might be eligible for immigration relief, but previously I wouldn't have known who to refer to. So we kind of heard people saying like, oh, now I might be able to do this additional layer of work that wasn't necessarily previously on my radar.
Actually, speaking of, that's something that in my previous position, I worked in regards to public benefits for the state of Missouri, and that exact sort of issue actually came up several times in hearings where you'd have we'd have an interpreter on so that I could have a conversation with someone about the benefits that they applied for. And there were a couple times where the interpreter was like, where I've had an interpreter say, this is the literal translation of what they said. Can I give you context based on the cultural background that I understand, being from the same culture as this person, that I know you will not hear when I say this? And that's that huge difference that there is, and the amount of times in which it made a huge difference in how the state would perceive the situation or the needs are of that particular person. And those are the things that can get lost if you're just thinking about
literal translation. Or
just
if you're just translating. Yeah, so it was really cool to see those interpreters getting all that additional information that they could use to then interpret more meaningfully.
I'm really glad that y'all mentioned that, because I think it was such a valuable resource for interpreters to be in the room, because it sounds like they really have such an important role that advocates and attorneys might not always think about. And so having language access, being able to have an interpreter who can provide that sort of context about literal translations is so important to think about. So I'm really glad that they were able to be in the room too.
Yeah, for sure.
So I kind of want to talk a bit about just some of the dynamics for immigrant survivors in Missouri and some of the things that were brought up in that training. So one of the things, as I was looking through the training materials, that really stood out for me is that they presented demographics for our state. And it kind of talked about the population. So the population of foreign-born immigrants in Missouri is 257,000. And to put that into context, if you took the populations of St. Joseph, Columbia, Branson, and Cape Girardeau and combined them, that total population is still just under the population of immigrants living in Missouri. So, I mean, what that tells me is that we know immigrant families live in and contribute to communities all across our state. I also really liked that slide because research is one of our core areas here at MCA DSV, and so if there are data nerds out there who really love demographics, this was a really great thing to think about. And so Gail, I know that in training you often talk about what are the different ways that we really know and understand the population of our community, who lives here, and how are we providing comprehensive outreach and services. So what are some tips that you might recommend for folks to look into there?
Yeah, so in terms of considering immigrant populations in Missouri, our one of our amazing coworkers, a colleague who's not with us anymore, but for those of you who remember Marie Montano, she always talked about really recognizing diversity within diversity. So acknowledging that immigrant populations across Missouri are coming from, all parts of the world and can have been here for a very short period of time, could have been here for generations, have all sorts of varying levels of immigration status. And so just recognizing that sometimes when we think about immigrants, we are really focused on undocumented folks, and we're really focused predominantly on Spanish-speaking folks, because those are populations that we see or may be here in larger numbers, but that immigrant populations are very, very diverse. So some ways to kind of figure out who is in your community, ELL, English language learner numbers, from the Department of Education are really helpful. Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, DESE. So you can always contact us and we can help you get that information quickly. So who is attending school in your community and what languages are children speaking? And that's going to give you a good idea of what languages adults are speaking as well. And then you can also look at U.S. Census data, but being mindful of the fact that folks participating in the U.S. Census may be folks with stronger English language skills and who are maybe more likely to have legal authorization to be in the U.S. So the U.S. Census is not capturing everyone. Mm-hmm. So also recognizing that whatever data we collect is probably low. Mm-hmm. And so acknowledging that as well. There are lots of other ways as well, sort of looking at predominant industries in your community, who's hiring, and that could be anywhere from professors and medical care providers to folks who are producing our food. Could be anyone in the agriculture industry, sort of looking at which industries exist and who they're hiring and where they're hiring from. Are they recruiting from other parts of the U.S. and other parts of the world? And also checking out your universities. I know Nicole's going to talk more about Title IX in a bit, but if you have a university or a college in your community, you are very likely to have international students. So there are lots of ways that we can help you here to identify the populations you have in your community and start to then engage and do effective and active outreach with those populations.
Yeah, those are really great resources. And I think, really particularly looking at what are the main industry areas and economic areas in your community and where are people hiring and recruiting from. Because that really helps to give you a strong snapshot of your community. Those are really great resources, Gail.
Thank you.
So something else I kind of want us to touch on that y'all talked about in the training are some of the challenges and fears of immigrant survivors and the barriers that exist whenever they are trying to seek safety and seek support services. Can y'all talk a bit about what some of those are?
So I can start that, and if folks want to jump in, there's such diversity within all the survivors that we serve in this work. Everyone's going to have kind of a different challenge, a different fear, a different level of understanding or misconception around systems. But what we see a lot in the domestic and sexual violence movement are immigrant and refugee survivors who may be married to American citizens who have intentionally sought out a foreign-born spouse because they know that our immigration system through marriage really creates a sense of dependency. And so when a U.S. citizen or legal permanent resident marries a foreign-born spouse, the spouse is dependent on the American citizen or legal permanent resident for the first 2 years of marriage to sponsor them. And what often happens is the husband or the spouse, the husband or wife in that situation, will sponsor initially and then let that sponsorship drop as a way to manipulate, control, abuse their intimate partner. So we see a lot of survivors in the U.S. who are married to U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents who are being abused and feel that they have little to no recourse, and that obviously gets worse if you have children with a U.S. citizen. We see a lot of threats of deportation. I'll deport you, I'll have you deported, and I'll keep the kids because the kids won't be able to go with you to your home country. We see a lot of folks in the U.S., maybe immigrant populations, maybe both parties are immigrants, but they're far from home. They're far from their support systems. So the traditional folks that you would seek if you were sexually assaulted at work, or if your intimate partner was hurting you, maybe you would go to your mom or your aunt. Maybe you would go to a religious leader or a neighbor or a trusted elder. But what we're seeing with folks who, especially here in rural parts of Missouri, who may be part of an immigrant population, they may be far from the traditional support systems. And then even if you have a community where maybe there are several hundred or even several thousand people speaking the same language or from the same country or the same region of a country, it may be that population is all maybe very young and very sort of working and migrating age, which means again that the elders and the people that you would traditionally go to for sources of wisdom and information and knowledge are not here. They are back home in the home country. So we see a lot of isolation. We see a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment right now. So folks who are here maybe even on tourist visas or on student visas, or who are here maybe married to someone working, so you can come, sometimes you can come as the spouse of a person with a work visa. You may, if you're experiencing abuse by your intimate partner or by a neighbor or by a family member, you may, even if you have legal status, fear talking about that because you may already feel like you're not accepted as part of the community, or you're seen as other, you're seen as taking someone's job. So we know that that's an issue. Do you all have other thoughts on the challenges and misconceptions and fears that survivors face from immigrant refugee communities?
Yeah, and just to kind of to continue along your thought, it's not just whether you might have documentation or even legal permanent residency status, but somebody in your family might not, or somebody who is close to you that you're afraid is going to be affected by interacting with the system. And so a lot of times, even if somebody would otherwise be safe because they have either asylee status or refugee status or they're a legal permanent resident, it's likely that there's somebody within their close proximity who does not have those safeties, and they're going to be very mindful of wanting to protect the people within their own community as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really great point.
Yeah, so thinking about maybe an example where someone's experiencing childhood sexual abuse, and maybe the child experiencing that, as you said, has status or may even be a U.S. citizen, but other members of their family may not be, and the child may be hesitant to report because if Children's Division or law enforcement comes in and does an investigation, they're going to find out that other folks in the family lack status. So it's a really great point.
And that's something I was going to bring up, was the number one thing that I hear is concern about the children, right? Like, that's the story that we hear. Parents are here. Mothers are here making a better life for their kids, and that is their main focus and their main priority. And anything that could possibly threaten that, we're just not going to go there. So even if there are avenues to find legal recourse or find shelter or advocacy, there are all those things that make it a challenge. The fear of deportation, the language access, the just general dynamics of a relationship that has abuse and control, on top of, I know that I'm at risk of losing my children, and that's not unique to immigrant survivors, but it is a number one priority.
Mm-hmm. Well, especially when you counter the fact it's not I'm just losing my children, but I'll still get to visit them. I might be losing my children, and we might be in different countries. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's also a lot to for the children themselves. Even if you know that you're safe, having to hold that I have to take care of my whole family because they're here for me, so it's my responsibility to make sure that nothing happens to them because of the sacrifices they put to be here for me. And so there's a lot of really complicated family dynamics that come.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about what happens after you come to the U.S., but what we know is that a lot of folks seeking asylum right now on our southern border are fleeing sexual and domestic violence and other forms of oppression in their countries of origin. and are then traveling through other countries to get here. So if you're coming, from a country that's south of Mexico, you're having to travel through Mexico, through your own country, through maybe other countries, through Mexico into the U.S., and we know that migration creates vulnerability, especially for women and children. And so these folks may have experienced sexual violence by law enforcement in their countries of origin, and then through the process of migrating by other people in positions of power, by military personnel. And so if you come into the U.S. and you've had that experience, then you may not see law enforcement as a trustworthy entity, even if you have asylum status, even if you're in process and you're not necessarily fearing deportation, you may not see people in positions of authority as safe people. And then when we think about our domestic and sexual violence programs, does everyone in our community understand that while we receive government funding, that we are nonprofit entities with confidentiality requirements, and you can come to us and not call law enforcement, you can come to us and we won't call law enforcement. But I think there may also be a lack of knowledge and awareness, as there would be with me. If I migrated out of desperation to another place, I would not know how their systems work, I would not know who was trustworthy, I would not know anything about confidentiality requirements. And so really going back to your comment earlier about outreach and recognizing who's in our community, part of our main goal as domestic and sexual violence advocates should be to begin educating community members to alleviate some of these fears and misconceptions so that they can actually reach out and seek help.
Yeah, that's such a great point.
And I think that our national conversation around immigration right now is very focused on legality and how are people getting here or being deported, and that's the question, is like you're either crossing legally or illegally and you're going to be deported or not. And really it's so much more complicated than that. But if that's your understanding of law enforcement and of government in the place where you are and you experience violence, it's very easy to understand why someone would think, if I go looking for help, the result is going to be deportation, because that's all I hear about. And they're not going to prioritize my health and my well-being. What I thought the trainers did a really good job of over those 2 days was letting us know that actually there are tons of statutes, tons of letters written from Department of Homeland Security and other entities that are saying people who, specifically immigrant women, but people who come to our country and are victims of crime, especially women who are victims of domestic and sexual violence, have protection, that they should be helping them get better and get the resources they need should be the priority of not only advocates and attorneys, but our government as well. And they should be focusing on that and not putting them into deportation proceedings.
Right.
Which was a misconception I had too, as someone who didn't know that much about all of these visa options before.
Yeah. So let's build on that a little bit, because I know in the training, which was over the course of 2 days, but y'all spent a lot of time really talking about what resources and services exist for immigrant families and how can we as advocates help them access those services safely. And so one thing, as I was looking through the training materials, that really stood out for me was being able to kind of talk about what is a sensitive location. So what are safe locations for families? And I kind of wanted us to talk about that for a little bit, because I think that in Missouri, we have really strong confidentiality laws that we're proud of, and they even build upon the confidentiality laws in the Violence Against Women Act. So it's not something, it surprised me, and it's not something that I think a lot of folks would know about, but our domestic violence shelters in Missouri can be considered a sensitive location. So can y'all talk a bit about what a sensitive location is and the importance of them?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project, at this training, and then also in a lot of their documentation, a lot of their resources, a lot of their website materials, a lot of their webinars, they talk about sensitive locations. And what federal policy says is that federal immigration enforcement activities, including arrests, are prohibited at sensitive locations. So going back to what Nicole was saying, there is still, at the federal level, a basic commitment to the protection of victims of crime. And so this federal policy prohibits federal immigration enforcement activity at sensitive locations, in particular for children and victims of abuse. So sensitive locations include schools and hospitals, places of worship, public demonstrations, and locations that could be viewed as being near or being near a sensitive location, with organizations serving victims of crime or abuse given as an example. And so what the U.S. government is saying is like, yes, immigration is a complicated issue, and yes, we are engaging in some enforcement activity, but we should not be enforcing immigration law at schools, hospitals, places of worship, public demonstrations, or organizations serving victims of crime or abuse. And that's a pretty broad range of organizations if you kind of get right down to it. So children should not fear going to school. Parents should not fear going to parent-teacher conferences. People should not fear seeking health care. People should not fear engaging in worship. People should not fear going to a courthouse to apply for an order of protection. People should not fear going to a rape crisis center or a shelter. So there are some caveats to that. Courthouses are not considered sensitive locations all around. So if you are at a courthouse for a criminal hearing where you have been accused of something, ICE may take action at the courthouse against you as a person who's been accused of a crime. But the victim of that crime or the witnesses to that crime, those folks would be considered as being involved in a sensitive location. Folks applying for an order of protection, folks going to a custody hearing, those types of places are considered sensitive locations based on the understanding of the information that I got at this training by National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project. And then the other thing that these folks did at the training was remind us again and again about VAWA protections. And so Violence Against Women Act prohibits the disclosure of survivors' personal identifying information, which we all know. Violence Against Women Act also prohibits the Department of Homeland Security, our immigration enforcement, ICE, from using information provided by a perpetrator about a victim. So let's say that an American citizen is abusing their intimate partner who's not authorized to be in the U.S., and as part of their abuse, they're saying, I'm going to call ICE or I'm going to call immigration and report you. VAWA says that immigration should not use that information to take action against a victim once they know that domestic violence is occurring. And then VAWA also requires certification by ICE officials that they did comply with confidentiality provisions and that they did not make an arrest at a sensitive location. So once ICE officials do make a detention, they have to fill out a form saying we detained this person not in a sensitive location. So there's sort of checks and balances in place. And then there are other confidentiality protocols as well that they reminded us of, FIPSA and VOCA. So as DVSB providers, we're often receiving FIPSA and VOCA money. Those also have confidentiality requirements prohibiting us from sharing information about the survivors we serve with anyone, including immigration officials. So that's all really helpful information for us to have. But also, if I did not know that before this training, then do we truly believe that the survivors of violence in our communities know that? Yeah. So again, it's kind of up to us to educate ourselves and then really be trying to educate communities that you can trust us, that we are here to serve you, and that these federal protections exist, even in a climate that may not seem immigrant-friendly at the moment. These protections exist.
Yeah.
And I want to follow that up with a couple of points. One being that on the state level here in Missouri, in addition to the federal protections that are going to come along with the Violence Against Women Act and the other grant funding that our programs receive, we have some very, as you mentioned, Matthew, very strong confidentiality laws in order to protect survivors. Those will also apply to any survivor of any status who is staying within one of our programs. And those are going to be, so those same confidentiality, the 455.220 for domestic violence shelters and 455.003 for rape crisis centers and the revised statutes in Missouri, those are going to apply to them as well, which means it's the exact same practices that an advocate is going to use for any survivor within their shelter or within those receiving services from their organization. It's the exact same thing. You're going to do it in the exact same way. Now, one of the things that I know that can be incredibly scary is if ICE agents show up at your door, because we can talk about how these are all the things that should and should not happen. But the reality is, as a lot of our advocates already know from having to work within systems, is that they don't always happen exactly the way they should. So the importance of knowing how things should happen is beneficial, A, because hopefully you will have people within the system who are aware of those facts, or if you remind them, will respect that. But also you can know as an advocate, and you can safety plan around these, and you can also make sure that you're having documentation, or you're able to have these conversations about how you're going to prove different things. But for example, if ICE does show up at your door, one of the things that they might say is that A, that they're law enforcement or police, and not identify themselves as somebody from ICE specifically. So it's always important to ask if you can see their badge. In addition, they might say that they have a warrant. If it is not a warrant signed by a judge, you would be breaching confidentiality by allowing that person within your shelter and to give that person any information. And so these are incredibly important conversations for people to have in their programs. A, for them to be able to recognize what a warrant signed by a judge looks like, to recognize what an ICE warrant might look like, what they call a warrant, and also to make sure that they have policies within their organization to figure out how they're going to respond to these things. And so that can be an incredibly important tool, because we don't want advocates to be in a position where if something happens and then you're listening to our conversation and they're like, that's not how they said it would happen, it's not supposed to happen that way. It's important to always plan, A, for your organization, but also for the survivors you're working with, on how are you best going to help them if the system isn't working the way it's supposed to.
Yeah. And that's such a really good point. I'm glad that you brought that up to kind of talk about, should an ICE agent show up at your door, regardless of whoever the person is in law enforcement, it can be really intimidating and really kind of scary in that moment. So being able to plan ahead allows you to take that time to take a breath and think about, okay, if you are a law enforcement agent, I need to see your badge. I need to see exactly where you work. Okay, you say you have a warrant. I need to see if a judge signed that, and if it's a judge I know. And it's okay to be asking those questions, but unless you think about that and you plan for it beforehand, it is going to feel really stressful in that moment.
Yeah, the consistent response that we always give of I cannot confirm or deny applies to federal officials as well as state officials, and to not maybe let that fear and anxiety of dealing with this kind of larger entity cause us to cave when we have federal and state statute protecting us and protecting the survivors we serve and protecting their confidentiality.
And if nothing else, and as terrifying as it can be to interact with any law enforcement, attorneys, anyone else when you're advocating, you're giving that I cannot confirm or deny. If it makes you feel any amount of safe, like if someone has your back, we know that the Hope House case was decided by the Supreme Court of Missouri that says what takes precedence is the safety of a survivor. So you do actually have both state law, federal law, and the Supreme Court of Missouri who are backing you up when you're telling a law enforcement or you're telling an ICE official, I cannot confirm or deny. So it's not just you alone. You actually do have an incredibly strong amount of backing, and that can help increase confidence in an otherwise terrifying moment for an advocate and for the survivors.
Yeah. Well, and I think that that's another really good point to bring up is, in our work, we faced a lot of really stressful crisis moments. But confidentiality's got your back. We have really strong laws here, and we're really proud of our confidentiality laws in Missouri. So that court case has your back.
Yeah, and Matthew, I know you said that we were going to supply some links on this page after the webcast.
Yeah, so we'll put links in our notes section.
Yeah, and we have a handy dandy handout from the Minnesota Coalition that we can share the link to that is like a how-to for advocates. If ICE shows up at your door, here are the 4 or 5 steps to follow. So we'll have that. And then I know that we have been talking about challenges, fears, and misconceptions, and a lot of that relates to immigration relief or lack thereof, or fear of deportation. So one of the things they kept mentioning throughout this training, and that Nicole, I think, just really mentioned a few minutes ago, is like there are options for people, and that survivors of violence should be telling any law enforcement official they come into contact with, any ICE official, I'm a survivor of violence, I'm a survivor of violence, I'm working with a domestic and sexual violence program, and to kind of slow that deportation train so that they can apply for relief. And so in addition to that sort of ICE how-to that we were just talking about linking, there's also a great document from the Blue campaign that we can link as well that is a visual that talks about the different types of immigration relief available to folks. So there is immigration relief under the Violence Against Women Act called VAWA relief. There are U visas, there are T visas, there's asylum, there's special immigrant juvenile status, there's continued presence, and there's deferred action. So we have deferred action for childhood arrivals, but there is just in general deferred action where the federal government can say we are going to stop this negative immigration action against you. We're going to defer our decision for a minute until we figure out what's happening. And so if you're working with a survivor who is in deportation proceedings or who fears deportation, it's really, really important to let them know that relief exists, put them in touch with an immigration attorney, a trusted immigration attorney right away. And another thing here at the Coalition we can do is help you find those resources and evaluate their situation. Are they married to a U.S. citizen? Was the crime committed against them a U visa qualifying crime? Did they do an order of protection? Did they report to law enforcement? Did a neighbor see what happened? Is Children's Division involved? There are all sorts of things that can help a person be eligible. And one of the most important things that can help them succeed in an immigration case is connection to a domestic and sexual violence program, an advocate who can support them in this work, and an immigration attorney who can carry their case forward.
So Gail, I have a question for you. I know that you have worked with a lot of immigrant survivors throughout your time. What have you found to be really important things to make sure you're including in safety planning that is different for immigrants that might not be something that people automatically think about when they're safety planning with their survivors?
Yes, I think as Nicole said, for a lot of the immigrant survivors we're working with, the key focus is I have made these extreme sacrifices for the safety of my children. And so what we'll often hear is that the fear of deportation is often not even necessarily about my own fear, but the fear that my children will be left without me, or that my children will also face deportation. And so for safety planning for survivors of violence, I often find that doing a deportation preparedness plan and doing powers of attorney. So if there were a raid at the company where you work and you were detained, who would you want to pick your children up from school? Those types of things. Safety planning around, like, if my intimate partner does call ICE and tell them I'm undocumented, then maybe to carry a letter saying I'm working with a domestic violence program, I'm in contact with an immigration attorney, I'm in the process of trying to file for immigration relief. Just really helping survivors to strategize how they can slow that train down in order to get the help that they need and clarify to any ICE officials that they are the victim of a crime. Safety planning as well around contact with law enforcement. So if a survivor does want to report to law enforcement, is law enforcement in the area immigrant friendly? Do they provide language access? Will they use an interpreter? Advocating that it is not the place of the law enforcement officer to dig around to try to figure out what the victim's status is. The focus of a criminal investigation should not be on an immigrant survivor's immigration status. It should be on the crime perpetrated against them. So safety planning around that. Is the sheriff's department friendlier than the police department? Is the highway patrol an option? Is there a DV detective who might be better than just the street cop who's at work at 3 a.m? So safety planning around those kinds of things would also be very, very helpful.
I'm glad that you talked about that, Gail. So good question, Sammy, because I think that also really shows there's safety planning that we can be prepared to do with survivors. And then there's also that sort of systems level advocacy of knowing how your municipal police department, how your sheriff's department, how the judges in your community are going to react. And a lot of that community education and organizing and understanding is a big part of this work too. So I know that Sammy, you came from working in public benefits before joining us here at the Coalition. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how immigrant families can access these public benefits. So thinking about, we've been able to work with them in a program, we've helped them apply for status, and now they need help in the community. How do folks access public benefits?
Sure. Well, there's a variety of different rules that are going to be depending on the benefit, on whether or not who can have access to them. Now, there are certain benefits that are going to be available to anyone regardless of your citizenship status, and that's going to be, you can get help from the legal services. So like Legal Services of Eastern Missouri and Legal Services of Western Missouri, you don't have to be a citizen in order to access their services, nor to get a divorce. You don't have to be a citizen in order to get a divorce, in order to get language access when you're engaging with systems or in the courthouse, for police assistance, for you to get a protection order, which has already been talked about. In order to have child custody, it is actually not, whether or not you are a documented citizen should not have an effect when they do the best interests of the child to decide who should have custody and how that should be broken up in regards to a child during a divorce. You can have your abuser criminally prosecuted, no matter what your status is. Your children can have public benefits even if you might not be available to access them. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in just a second. But you can also get like assistance for crime victims, shelter, transitional housing is not dependent on whether or not you have any documentation. You can get WIC for women's, infant, and children. And also you can receive school lunch and breakfast. Your kids can go to primary or secondary education. You can get emergency medical care. You can get VOCA. Like these are all things that it doesn't have any effect on whether or not you have anything that says what your citizenship status here is. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated when we're talking about specific benefits like SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. You should think I should know that. Here's the thing. We don't call it that in Missouri.
Yeah. We call it
So,
food stamps.
in Missouri, you're
we
going to
just call
hear
it food stamps here.
only referred to as food stamps, but sometimes you'll hear someone say SNAP. In regards to applying for programs like SNAP, there can be, since 1996, they've passed some laws that mean that you have to be a qualified immigrant, which has very specific rules in order to be considered a qualified immigrant. And also there's a 5-year ban. So if you've come to the United States since 1996 and you finally gain status as a qualified immigrant, which has a variety of things that go into that in order for you to get that status, you have to actually have that status for 5 years before you can apply for food stamps for yourself. Now, your children can still have access, and you can apply for food stamps for your children and not put yourself on there. And you cannot apply for yourself, and then you don't have to put whether or not you have a social security number or an identifying number of any kind. And your children can have access to these. And so I think that's something that is really an important thing for advocates to be aware of, because that's going to make a huge difference in families being able to access resources. So even if a parent is unable to do that, that is a way that they're still able to take care of their children. But it's still, as we talked about before, confusing law enforcement with ICE is something that can happen. Confusing any amount of social services, access to any sort of public system can be equally terrifying. Because if you think of all of them as an authority figure. So that, I always highly encourage advocates to go with survivors to public benefits offices, whether or not the person you're working with is an immigrant, or no matter what their documentation status is. It can be an incredibly terrifying process for survivors to interact with public benefits, and advocates can be incredibly helpful in these situations. So I always highly encourage that. But it's especially important when you're coming to situations like this, because the person behind the desk might not be aware.
And family support division officers are required by federal law to provide language access, but if the person at the front desk has never used an interpreter before, they may not know that they're supposed to or even how to. So advocacy in those situations can be really, really important.
Absolutely. And I always highly encourage anybody, if you're ever denied benefits from the Family Support Division, you can always, my 2 recommendations that I always give for people is you can always appeal it. You have 90 days to appeal a decision that's made, and then you can have a hearing. And so much of these systems are reasonably automated at this point, which means you might be getting denied, and it might not necessarily be an error on your part. And so if you ask for a hearing, you can have a hearing where you can talk about the reasons why you think you should be able to get these benefits. But I also think that it's important to, at the same time, reapply. So if you're going to ask for a hearing, reapply as well, just in case there is something that got mixed up. You're not going to have this huge gap of benefits that you might have otherwise been eligible for because you waited until after, because you're going to get your benefits up until the date, from the date you applied. So whenever that happens is where your benefits are going to be backdated to, which is why appealing is also incredibly important. But you can have a hearing and you can talk about, and they'll give you the evidence for why they made the decision they did. And you can also come and bring evidence and talk about why you believe that you should be available.
Yeah, and I think going back to the diversity of immigration statuses within families, as you were saying, Sammy, it could be that maybe mom is undocumented and not eligible for food stamps, but maybe she's pregnant and she is eligible for WIC. Maybe she has a 13-year-old son who came with her without authorization from their country of origin, not eligible for food stamps, but maybe there's also a 5-year-old who was born in the U.S. who is. And so sort of acknowledging that different family members are going to be eligible for different services, and to really work with the Family Support Division to call you, to call staff here at the Coalition, to figure out who's eligible for what and ensure that they are getting the benefits that they deserve.
Oh, and please call me Sammy. I'm a huge nerd when it comes to this, and I'm very passionate about people getting the services that they need in order to put themselves into a much better situation for both themselves and for their families. So I'm always really excited when I can talk about these programs because I definitely understand how terrifying and complicated it is to deal with them. So.
Yeah, and you're talking about safety planning, so we can also strategize safety planning around going to the Family Support Division to apply for these types of things. What if I don't have a social security number? Are they going to ask me for a legal permanent resident card? What am I supposed to do if this happens? What if they don't provide me an interpreter? And we can really safety plan with advocates on addressing those things before they come up and as they come up.
And I also encourage any advocate to put in time at your local Family Support Division office so that they are familiar with you and that you're familiar with their regular processes. So the processes that they're going to go through regardless of somebody's status or immigration status, so that by the time you're coming in and it's a specialized case, they're going to be familiar with your face, and they're also going to have an easier time having conversations with you and going through it. And you'll know, you won't be thinking both, is this not working this way because they're an immigrant, or is this not working this way because there's something wrong with how they're going through the system there? So you have a comparison to go through as well about how the system should be working, instead of the only time you're having any base time with people in the system in these particular cases is with someone who is an immigrant, and you might not be the reason why there's a breakdown there.
Yeah. Great point.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that the advocate is probably going to be, or could be, the expert on both, like, how any survivor should be able to access these services, but also how the immigration situation plays into it. And that's a lot of information to just know all the time. But the trainers talked a lot about, like, preparing, going to meet with people, make sure that you know the people who are working in your community, because they are people, right? They're working in these offices with these big intimidating titles and forms that you have to fill out, but they're people that you can connect with. And the other thing was that they offered, NewApp has this wonderful website that they work on all the time, updating resources. So another link that we can share is one that they showed us where they created a map. So you can select any state, and then you can go through each benefit and see, depending on what visa somebody might have applied for already or might be planning on applying for, what access they have. And it was really wonderful. So we can share that too.
Yeah, and it's explicit and comprehensive. And I think it is, as you brought up, like, this is a lot of information to know that can be intimidating. And I'm not telling you that you have to know everything to do with this. What I'm saying is that it's important to have these conversations so you know who to call. Because, and that's why I think the holistic approach that Gail was talking about, where they had so many different people in the room, why that's so important. Any of the things that we're talking about today, it's not on the advocate to have every single step of every single process memorized. It's just so that it is on them to know that these are things that they should be aware of and also have an understanding of how to access them. And who do you call to get the information that you need?
Well, and I think that goes back to your point that you said in the beginning, Sammy, of this training really allowed for people to get out of their silos and meet one another and learn more about each other's role, because everyone in that training has a role to play in this work, but we don't often have these opportunities to get out of our silo, to get out of our office and meet one another and learn about each other. So I think that, it really speaks to the importance of going out into your community, getting to know your community partners, forming really positive relationships. Yeah. So here at MCA-DSV, we work really closely with many of the Missouri colleges and universities. And we know that there are a lot of international students coming to our Missouri colleges and universities. So Nicole, could you speak a bit about some of the academic accommodations that they talked about in the training too?
Yes, so there was some identification of which students we're talking about, because it goes beyond international students. Definitely international students are included, and they're the ones who might have visas that are specific to coming to the U.S. to study at a certain college for a certain program, and usually they're limited in duration. They may have a requirement of a certain number of credits that they need to be enrolled in, but also remembering that there are going to be students who have that deferred action for childhood arrival, that DACA status. There are going to be students who are undocumented. I know they shared the statistic that 61% of kids who arrived in the U.S. under the age of 14 attend college, and they're undocumented while they attend. They will not fall into your international center. Those students won't be served by that center because they're not coming specifically as students from another country, right? And then you might
that's
also
a great
have,
point.
Yeah, and you might also have students from who have been here for a while and have lawful permanent resident status, but also need some of the same accommodations, including language access. So there's a lot going on with how we serve students. One might be language access in everything, right? Which we're supposed to be providing anyway. But for Title IX specifically, if a student discloses that they've experienced violence, our schools, not only secondary and higher education, but like elementary schools for kids who are coming with their parents, can be screening students, checking in with students to see, have they experienced any violence recently? Have they experienced violence any time in their life? And they can be asking the parents too, or asking about the parents. Not to dig into people's personal lives, not to get information, like Gail was saying, we're not focusing on what are your parents' immigration status, what's your immigration status, but what has been your experience? Have you been victimized? And if so, then you might be eligible for VAWA, T or U visa, or the SIJS, which is for juveniles. So if it's a student who is under the age of 18 or 21 in some states. But then when we do specifically think about Title IX, so they might be eligible for any of these visas and might need connections to attorneys for applying for those. But if we're thinking about specifically Title IX, schools, without doing much with the legal system, can provide accommodations to students who have experienced sexual violence. Even if it wasn't on campus, it doesn't have to be related to their time in school. They are still eligible for accommodations like access to counseling, medical and mental health services on campus. They can be changes to their class schedule, dining halls, housing. If they work on campus, a lot of international students have employment placement on campus, and that can be adjusted. But there's always a consideration, because those visas for students who come here specifically to study have strict requirements about how many classes they need to be enrolled in and how they're keeping up with their academics. So people working in international centers, people working in Title IX centers, people working in even in like a multicultural center where they might just have contact with students where they feel comfortable sharing. their experiences need to know that there are tons of opportunities to support that student. And so that would be another group of people who might want to click on the link about that shield and all these various visas that are available, and be talking with their Title IX coordinators. How are we going to provide accommodations that make sense for this student?
Yeah. Well, and, a couple of months ago on the webcast, we had a board member, Cynthia Copeland, who is in the Title IX office at Washington University. And so that could be a good opportunity to go back and listen to that webcast, learn more about all of the different resources Title IX affords. Because, just as you were saying, Nicole, for international and immigrant students, those same protections apply regardless. And so there is a lot of options for students to find that support on campus.
And one thing that the trainers brought up was to really screen not only the students' experience, but their families. And that's really important because maybe that student is not eligible for a certain visa. Maybe they don't need that. Maybe they're here to stay for their time in school, and that's the arrangement that they're good with, but a family member could receive some kind of protections that they don't have. And as we've been talking about, that family connection is very important. And it can cause people to not report crimes, to not access services that they need because they're worried about a loved one. So you can really help people be free by also considering what family members are they responsible for, or are they feeling responsible for, and how can I help those people too, even if they're not enrolled as students. So your advocacy role is really expansive.
Yeah, and we didn't mention this when we were talking a minute ago about VAWA T and U visas and SIJS and this visual shield that we're going to share, this PDF diagram. But when an individual applies for these forms of immigration relief, they can often include other family members as derivatives. So the USCIS word is derivatives. So if a mom has been victimized and is applying for maybe VAWA or U relief, some of her children who may be undocumented can also apply as derivatives. And so the children themselves may not be eligible for a visa if you're working with elementary students or college students, but their victimized family members might be, ultimately resulting in their safety and security as well.
Yeah, great point. So, final thoughts here. For those who weren't able to attend the training that we've been talking about, what is one point that's really stuck with the three of you since that training?
Well, I'm the prevention specialist here at the Coalition. I'm Nicole. And I've been thinking about how can we do prevention work specifically with creative solutions for immigrant women, because they did this great activity where we had to think of remedies to go on orders of protection that were specific to immigrant women, and why would they need that? Why would that affect somebody who is dealing with immigration status or filing or whatever else? And one of the main challenges is that these visas take so long. So they said many times, make sure that you're applying as soon as possible. As soon as you identify someone who needs a visa and is eligible, start that application process. But even if you do, things like work authorization, the opportunity to create like an economic foundation for your family and support them, takes potentially years. So one of the prevention strategies from the CDC, from Center for Disease Control and Prevention, is Stop SV. It's the opportunity, providing opportunities for economic growth for women and children, right? So when I think about that, for people who are coming to our shelters in Missouri, I assume that our advocates are doing safety plans, and then they're helping with how are we going to make sure you have stable housing, and how are we going to make sure that you get employment? Well, employment may not be an option, and so how can advocates be creative, right? The creation of opportunity and Stop SV doesn't go away because you're working with immigrant women or because work authorization isn't an option. So how are we creating those opportunities when the law makes it really challenging?
Yeah, that's a really good question to bring up. And, that's another opportunity for advocates to call us and talk about creative solutions of how we can really start trying to build those opportunities in our communities. Yeah.
I would have to say, one of the things that sticks with me the most, and I think it's just such an incredibly important thing for us to remember in our jobs as advocates and also as citizens who are allies, is that it's not enough to say that it shouldn't matter what your status is in order for you to receive this or in order for you to access this, because us telling that to an immigrant who might not be documented and then they're going to engage with that system or engage to ask for that, the person who they're trying to get that benefit from might not know that. Mm-hmm. Because there is a lot of, not just from people in the community, but people who are working within the system might not be aware that something is not necessary for them to need a social security number, or it might not be necessary for them to know what kind of status citizenship-wise the person requesting this benefit is, or getting food from a food pantry or anything like that. You don't actually aren't required to give a social security number or status. But if people in their organization are training you to do that, it's not enough just to send someone and say, hey, no, look, I should be able to access this even if I'm not a citizen. You shouldn't be required to out yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so it's incredibly important for us as advocates to be mindful that we're putting in the groundwork and that we're available to help people as safely as possible get the things that they should be available to them, and know that just because we know it, they should have access to it, doesn't mean everyone else knows that or is willing to do the things that it takes to get them the things that they do. So,
yeah, I know there's often a philosophical debate around enabling and empowerment. And I think that obviously talking to survivors about their comfort level, there may be folks who have high level of English proficiency, high level of understanding of systems, may have been in the U.S. for a very, very long time. You can have been in this country for 50 years and lack authorization to be here. So being undocumented does not mean you don't necessarily understand systems or speak fluent English. So checking with survivors, how do you feel about going to the Family Support Division yourself? But the bottom line is that if folks have fear, anxiety, or aren't getting a good response, it is not enabling in a negative way to provide that frontline assistance to them. In fact, it is enabling them to access the service that they deserve and are legally entitled to. And so really recognizing that we often sort of encourage people to go do things by themselves because we think that is empowering, and it can be. But for survivors who face potential deportation, who are facing systems that are maybe themselves engaging in xenophobic behavior, or again, frontline staff who just don't know how to get an interpreter, our presence is incredibly important. So I would, agree with Sammy in that sense. And then my final thought is we've talked a lot about women and children during this webcast, and knowing that there's a great level of vulnerability, especially for women and children during migration. But I just want to say that I came away from this training also with a stronger understanding of the fact that VAWA, UNT relief, SIJS relief, asylum, those are not gender specific. Now they can, of course, have components of gender-based violence related to them, but these forms of relief are available to a person of any gender, including trans folk and non-binary individuals, and they apply, especially in the case of VAWA, where a marriage is a requirement, they apply to any legal marriage in the state. So for some states that may be, what's the kind of marriage where it's
you're talking about common law marriage?
Common law marriage. So Missouri does not have common law marriage, but some states do. So if you were working with a survivor who came here from a state where common law marriage was legal, that would maybe make them eligible for VAWA, and same-sex marriage. And so just recognizing that we need to ensure that any survivor of violence of any gender, of any sexual orientation, is provided service and provided access to these types of relief.
And as a follow-up, marriage can also, if your partner is a citizen and your partner was previously married and never dissolved that previous marriage, and you, as somebody who might not be a citizen, if you married that person and you had a marriage ceremony and you believe yourselves to be married, that also counts. It is enough that you, in good faith, entered into a marriage that you believed to be a valid legal marriage, even if there was something else that prevented that from being. So that does not stop you from accessing services, even if the person you're with might use that as a way to say, you can't access these services, you can't leave me. That's actually not the case.
Yeah. Really great points.
Final thoughts. It's just, this is really complicated.
Yeah.
It was like a 2-day training, and there was so much more. Everybody still had questions. And I think the main thing is that we need to be conscious of creating environments where people, especially survivors and immigrant survivors, feel comfortable sharing information with us that makes them vulnerable, right? You're not going to know that someone's eligible for certain visas unless you create an environment where they feel comfortable sharing their documentation status, where they feel comfortable sharing their past experiences of victimization in their country of origin as they were making their journey here or even here. So the basis is don't be afraid, like Sammy was saying, of these big entities and all these rules that seem really complicated, because again, you have the protections of the law that, like, your job is to support survivors, to protect their confidentiality and make sure that they get the resources they need.
And you have the coalition to support you.
Yeah, that's right.
And also the people that you're working with, they're not going to share everything with you right away.
Yeah.
So you might be working with someone for a while before they're comfortable disclosing to you that they're not documented. And it's not that they're trying to be sneaky or hide things from you or game you in any way. Just know that you're going to find out information about people's experiences in a very slow pace as they learn to trust you. And that's why it's so important for us to be able to offer that kind of advocacy where we're building that sort of foundation of trust through transparency and follow through, so that they get to a level that we're able to actually help them access the things that they're entitled to, that they might be most frightened of. So it might take them a really long time to share that information with us.
Yeah. Well, thank y'all so much for sitting with me today and sharing your takeaways from this training earlier this month. Just as we've said, there will be links in the comment section of this webcast for many of the resources that we mentioned. And just as Gail mentioned, we are your coalition, so we're your resource. All right. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.